Okay, this is lecture for Chapter 11, Part 2. We last left off talking about the scapegoat theory as part of the theories of prejudice, which you should have written down on your study guide. And the next theory of prejudice is the authoritarian personality type theory. What this theory states, and what you probably need to write down, is that extreme prejudice is a personality trait of certain individuals. And this is a conclusion that's been supported by research. It basically indicates that people who show strong prejudice towards one minority or prejudice in general are typically very intolerant of all minorities. And what research was able to uncover is that there is basically a learned authoritarian personality type, and that these individuals rigidly will conform to conventional cultural values. They oftentimes see issues as very clear cut matters that are either right or wrong, that there's no in between. They typically look at themselves as the authority, and that people should always go along with themselves. And even the opposite patterns are found to be true, that you have individuals who are very tolerant of at least one group are typically very tolerant of all people. These authoritarian personality theories, as I mentioned, is typically something they found is learned. These individuals oftentimes grow up in very cold, very rigid environments where there's not a lot of love or a lot of emotion that's shown. They're oftentimes growing up in very conventional backgrounds where things are oftentimes very clear cut. So this is becoming ingrained in their personality. Next theory of prejudice is the culture theory as well as the conflict theory. These are both on your study guide. In terms of the culture theory, this basically states that prejudice is embedded in culture, that we learn this, and it's found in certain people. And it states that it's probably found a little bit in everyone because any culture that you're a part of, you're learning that culture. So we're basically learning a culture of prejudice, that it's taught within our culture to view certain people as better or worse than others. Some suggest this comes from our very capitalist environment where we're very competitive and very individualized, but that's the culture theory, that we're learning it growing up in certain cultures. And the last theory of prejudice is the conflict theory. And this theory basically states that prejudice is a tool used by powerful people in the United States to basically oppress others. So that's what the self-justification means, is that it's a tool basically to self-justify oneself in order to oppress others. It's another conflict-based argument, and basically the idea would be that some people are oppressed in order for others to seek out that advantage and become maybe wealthier or more advanced or more powerful at the expense of other people. So that's the conflict theory. Next on your study guide is discrimination. And by definition, which is not up on your slide that you'll need to write down for discrimination, is the unequal treatment of various categories of people. So prejudice involves a thought, but no action has taken place at that point. Discrimination, on the other hand, is something that becomes far more serious because now we have basically treated people differently. There's unequal treatment of various categories of people. So prejudice refers to attitudes, which is your next bullet point on your study guide. Prejudice is a matter of attitudes. Discrimination is a matter of action. So prejudice and discrimination are very closely related. Oftentimes, prejudicial thoughts can lead to discriminatory actions. It too can be positive or negative. And one area that I find is very serious is institutional prejudice or discrimination, which is up on your slide and it's your next bullet point on your study guide. And this is when we start seeing biases built into the operation of society's institutions. So this becomes far serious because it's deeply ingrained and woven into the institutions of our society. So our school systems, our hospitals, our workforce, our law enforcement, our banking system having prejudicial thoughts or discriminatory practices. We're oftentimes really slow to recognize this or condemn people because frequently these are institutions we trust. They're people that we oftentimes have respect for, maybe respected public officials or long established traditions. And so we don't always recognize when it's happening. But it's basically bias that's inherent to the operations of society. And they tend to reinforce each other. So that's why it's very serious, because it's so deeply woven into society and it can be very oppressive, very harmful for individuals trying to break out. Let's see here. talked about that. So when we talk a little bit about prejudice and discrimination, they can definitely form a very vicious cycle. They oftentimes perpetuate themselves because oftentimes by this label, by these thoughts, groups are placed in situations where they socially are disadvantaged and find it very difficult to break out of. And oftentimes this leads to long-term generational inferiority within the social structure. It leads to long-term oppression, and then the cycle oftentimes is taught and learned, and it repeats itself over and over and over. And that's why we see historical or history of groups being oppressed for long periods of time because the cycle oftentimes repeats itself. And on your next screen here, it just shows you a little bit of that visual. The stage one, the prejudice and discrimination is happening. Oftentimes, it can be through ethnocentric attitudes, economic exploitation, which leads to large categories of people facing social disadvantages, which pushes them to the bottom rungs of society. And then, of course, that leads to thoughts in society that minorities are inferior. And that, of course, teaches renewed prejudice, discrimination, and then the cycle continues to repeat itself and keeping people at lower rungs of society. Next bullet point on your study guide is pluralism. By definition, pluralism is that people of all races and ethnicities are distinct, but they have equal social standing. So this is what we strive to see in terms of patterns of interaction. This would be the most positive, that we would equally recognize all people, no matter what their race, what their ethnicities, allow them to be who they need to be, who they want to be, and they still have equal social standing. We sometimes say that we're pluralistic, but we're 100% not there yet for probably 3 reasons. One, there are a lot of people that are still very much segregated and secluded in society into their areas of their own kind. And frequently, even though it may appear that people have choices to do that, in reality, people are oftentimes seeking out those kinds of interactions because that's where they feel safe and secure. So they're not always doing it 100% on their own will. Also, we know that our tolerance for diversity only goes so far, and we've seen that through the existence of repeated hate crimes going on. And we know by just factual speaking things, looking at examples of income differences, housing differences, job differences, education differences, that not everyone does have equal social standing. And so we're going to continue looking at the different patterns of interaction. And the next pattern of interaction is assimilation, which is your next bullet point on your study guide. And assimilation is the process by which minorities gradually begin adopting patterns of the dominant culture. This is what frequently happens the most in terms of patterns of interaction. Oftentimes, new immigrant arrivals, minority groups will be here present in the United States. And upon first arriving here, it's basically about learning survival skills. And eventually, as they live here longer and longer, they slowly start adopting patterns of the dominant group. So the amount of assimilation will oftentimes vary by category. Assimilation typically involves changes in one's ethnicity, but not necessarily changes in their race. Next pattern of interaction is miscegenation, which is not on your study guide, but this is also a little bit of a form of assimilation, and that's when we start to see biological reproduction by individuals of different racial and ethnic categories. So in essence, what miscegenation is interracial marriages. Next pattern of interaction is segregation. And as you can probably see, we're starting to go from the most positive to patterns of interaction that are more harmful. By definition, segregation is the physical and social separation of categories of people. We've seen this throughout history. This typically enforces separation. It's very harmful to minority groups. And we've had 2 patterns or 2 types of segregation take place in history. De jure segregation, which was by law, and that's what we saw in the South, particularly after the ending of slavery with Jim Crow laws and the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision that made separate but equal constitutional. The other type of segregation that still exists today and that is legal is de facto segregation. And that segregation by fact still continues in the United States. And what de facto segregation is basically when we start seeing segregation based on residential patterns. So people associating and keeping to their own kind because that's where they feel safe and secure. Also in the Midwest, we see a lot of what we call hypersegregation, and that's when people have little contact of any kind with people beyond their local community because we're so very rural that oftentimes we don't have an opportunity to see anyone very different than ourselves because there isn't much diversity within our small communities. The next pattern and the most harmful pattern of interaction is genocide, and that's when we see the systematic killing of one category of people by another. This is our most deadly form of racism and ethnocentrism. It, of course, violates every moral standard that we have, but it's also important to recognize this because, in a way, this is how the United States has been built. We had the segregation of African Americans. We also saw the genocide of Native Americans in terms of how they were treated. Um, so that's an important understanding in terms of the most harmful form of patterns of interaction. So I'm going to pause here and upload this video, and then your third part will involve all the different racial and ethnic groups that exist here in the United States right now, some of the largest, and I'm going to give you a brief history of each one of these groups. So this will be the end of this video.